Well, this is Brian Green, and today joining me is Steve Holloway. Steve Holloway he's a founder of Signify. He's been, for about a decade, he's been an analyst that looks at trends and things happening in the informatics space and healthcare informatics. And of course, RSNA was the latest big event in healthcare, and especially in imaging informatics. And so Steve is here to talk to us about RSNA and some of the trends that were there, some of the things that, for those of us that couldn't make it to RSNA, we can talk a little about what his experience was there and what we can all look for in the industry. So Steve, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be here.
Yeah. So I was at RSNA this year, and it was interesting to me that the exhibitor hall looked exactly like it does every other year, even though this is the first time after COVID that the exhibit hall was the same, just the number of people in the exhibit hall was lower, right? But it seemed like most of the vendors were there, most of the people that I would normally see at that conference. What was your experience there? Did you see most of the vendors that you were looking for? And
yeah, so I would say probably about 80% of the vendors we would normally see were there, which was fantastic, and I think was a better show out than maybe some were expecting. Obviously, it was notable there was a lower attendance from international vendors, particularly from Asia Pacific.
Yeah.
I think some of the regulations of getting to Chicago and back, etc., made that very difficult for them, so perhaps a wise decision.
Right.
But in general, I'd agree, fewer people, but the same vendors there. And I think the other point I'd make, and the feedback I had from most vendors, was that actually, although sort of new business opportunities might have been a little bit lower than in past shows in terms of potential walk-up business, there was a lot more sort of in-depth customer interaction. And vendors really felt that customers who were there were really needed to be there rather than, going to enjoy the show. They were actually going because they had a real purpose. And so it felt like, I think, because obviously being back to face-to-face, many of them felt it was still a worthwhile show. They felt that they got something out of it, and certainly those customer interactions in more depth were really important for them. And obviously, with it being a little bit less hectic, they could spend more time with each customer as well. So I think overall, it was as good as could have been expected for most vendors.
Yeah, I think I can reflect kind of what you said as a vendor that was there. I felt like this year at RSNA, I had much more in-depth conversations with people, whereas in a normal RSNA, you've just got a parade of people that you're seeing all day long. And this time, I might have an hour and a half with somebody instead of 15 minutes, and we were able to get a lot more into the weeds. And those were the folks, that were there because they needed to be there, because they're looking for something. They need something because, they're trying to figure out what's going on with certain products or in the industry. Now, I know not last RSNA was kind of a dud, but the one before that, there was some talk about cloud, and I'm interested in, from an enterprise imaging and informatics perspective, what are the vendors doing with cloud? So what was your impression on cloud?
I think we saw a continuation of the theme, definitely, in terms of more availability of cloud solutions, particularly around vendors in the enterprise imaging space starting to move more and more of their portfolio onto cloud and having public cloud partnership options as well. Yeah. So more of a presence of the Microsofts and Amazons and Googles in the room as well, through PACS or enterprise imaging partners.
Yeah. So let me just...
And the feedback...
I just want to ask you about that. So did you say that Azure and Amazon, their presence is more as a partner to companies like PACS vendors and so forth, or were they kind of standing on their own?
At the moment, at the moment, yes. Obviously, that's starting to change in the recent news in terms of M&A with Microsoft acquiring Nuance, and you're starting to get Oracle, now because of the RSENA deal getting involved.
Yeah.
We're hearing some very recent news around Amazon as well, and potentially a M-Modal too. So it would seem to me that the big tech vendors, and particularly the big cloud vendors, are starting to get more serious about healthcare technology.
They're pulling more into the fold as opposed to...
They're pulling more into the fold, but I think the question is will they be, like you say, that frontline application vendor, like a Nuance or like a PAX vendor, or will they really be the architecture and the technology behind that? And our view at this stage, and particularly when we analysed the Microsoft deal last year with Nuance, it was our expectation that really that was a major play for Microsoft from a cloud Azure perspective of winning more cloud business and technology, as opposed to wanting to be that frontline application service provider.
Yeah, one of the questions that some folks have asked me about Nuance with Azure and just in the cloud in general is there was this sense before that merger that it didn't matter which cloud vendor you chose, whether it's Google or Azure or Amazon for your storage. I mean, let's face it, those are the big kind of compute and storage cloud vendors. And of course, you have NetApp and Dell out there trying to play in that space too, but the thought was that they're vendor agnostic, right? And now some of the questions I'm hearing are, well, if I have Nuance and I use PowerShare, I use PowerScribe or something like that, does that mean I'm bound to Azure, right? That's one of the questions people have. How separated are they keeping those businesses, or are they really going to be, are we going to see a future scenario where, you pick your cloud vendor and then that kind of pigeonholes you into a certain portfolio of companies and products?
Yeah, I don't think it can be that pigeonholed. I think just with the nature of where we are and the complexity of health IT deployment, and some of the size of these networks and the complexity of them in terms of different regions and different, sub-applications, etc. I don't see how it's going to be possible to center down on one single cloud provider for everything.
Yeah.
I think you're probably going to have a multi-cloud environment for some time. It may be the case, particularly from an EMR perspective, or if some of those big foundational systems from an enterprise perspective are tied to a singular cloud provider.
Yeah.
It is more likely that over time the others will migrate in that direction. But I think, in the midterm at least, we're going to see multi-cloud and certainly hybrid multi-cloud as the mainstay approach moving forward. And it was notable from discussions there was a definite ramp up in interest from customers in terms of the cloud discussion.
Yeah.
But there were kind of two real reasons behind that. One was the architecture discussion, which is really, we've realized over COVID and the lockdown that actually, cloud really will provide us certain performance benefits and certain working and workflows that will, make our lives much easier. So therefore we want to shift to cloud. But there's also the business model side of it as well, which is we like the SaaS business model that comes with cloud normally. We want more predictable IT spending. We want more predictable application and hosting and storage. How can we do that? And is cloud a conduit to moving towards that more predictable business model? So that's always been the challenge with cloud, I think, in terms of the imaging informatics space, is from a customer side is understanding, is it really an infrastructure and architecture play, or is it really a business model play, or both? And that has a bearing then in terms of the route to deployment, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. So, so what I'm hearing is that cloud is continuing to gain momentum. The idea of going to cloud. I know that there's a lot of folks still hesitant about cloud, especially in the U.S. market where I live, and hopefully we're going to start to see a little bit more comfort level with cloud. And RSNA kind of reflected that, because you saw a lot more vendors that were talking about cloud. They were hearing from their customers that they were considering moving more infrastructure to a SaaS model. Right?
Yeah, and I would add to that. I think there was growing acceptance that cloud is sort of the long-term direction of travel.
Yeah. Okay.
But there are still some concerns around cybersecurity, around performance compared to on-premise, and also how ready vendors are to move the sort of full stack of their portfolios to cloud natively as well. And I think once you dug under the hood of most vendors who are presenting at the show, most would say we would struggle to do everything natively in terms of, full packs, cardio, AV, image exchange, VNA, all in one go. Most have a stepwise R&D development roadmap that sort of moves cloud natively in the next, say, 2, 3, 5 years. So I think that's also something that customers are looking at is what do we want to move now?
Yeah.
And you could look at clinical viewing or you could look at VNA and say those are more likely to move because of, the native benefits you get from moving to cloud and the need for accessibility, etc. for those pieces.
Right.
But actually, do we need to be moving advanced phys today? Do we need to be moving core diagnostic reading and PACS workflow today?
Yeah.
In many cases, probably not, because it's a big undertaking. So if we move partly and go hybrid today, that saves us X in the next year or two, and then as those systems become more readily available natively in the next couple of years, we'll look at transitioning further. So I think most are looking at this not as one big bang, but as a gradual adoption shift.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's this all is reminiscent to me of when virtualization was all the rage, right? Nobody's virtualizing; it's just moving a little slower, right? I remember at RSNA, it's like, we're going to start supporting virtualization. It was like 2 years later, everybody's VMware and whatever. But yeah, it seems like the cloud is just kind of this slow process. I think a lot of it has to do with the ownership of data and people nervous about who has custody of the data. So. It's good, though, to see that the industry is starting to realize that this is the direction that the rest of the world is going, and we need to catch up in healthcare, right? We're always a few years behind in healthcare. Now, speaking of which, and I think almost a related topic, obviously for the last couple of years, AI is always a discussion point. It's been a lot of marketing over the last many years, and what was your experience this year with AI? There real solutions? Are we kind of still in that marketing phase of it, or what's it look like?
I think we're probably somewhere between. So from our view, I think a couple of interesting points. One, there are actually new AI vendors on the show floor, and quite a number of them, which was a little bit of a surprise to suggest that investment is still strong in the sector.
Right.
There is still a heap of hype and marketing going on to drive that. But at the same time, I think we're starting to see a different, and certainly some of the sort of better vendors who are actively commercializing and actually making AI work start to rise above the parapet, as it were, and stand apart from some of the other sort of smaller solutions out there that maybe are over-promising and under-delivering today. And it's a shift in how it's being marketed as well. If you look back the last couple of years, it's been very much, look at us, we've got X percentage, 95% specificity, or it's all around being around accuracy and proving that AI works. I would say there is growing acceptance now that AI does work and is comparable as research has proliferated in the last few years, and now it's about how do you solve the last mile challenges of getting AI into the workflow and actually making it commercially viable and usable for radiologists.
Right.
And there's still a bit of a gulf to work through there. The best vendors and those vendors that we're starting to see really get serious, I would say, in terms of deployment at scale, are now looking at saying, well, it's not about providing an individual point solution, it's about providing a whole suite of solutions, either for a particular body area or for a particular application type. And how do we bring that suite together and embed it into the workflow and into the environment and the radiologist to make it easier for them to use?
Yeah. It's so one of the things that I've had customers talk to me about, it's a little bit of a frustration level on AI, is there's this feeling that if my vendor doesn't have a specific AI tool, I don't get to use it, right? And people are wondering at what point are we going to be able to plug and play AI, right? If, there's this really cool algorithm that can do X or Y, how can I leverage that in my facility without having to go to a specific vendor to go get that's integrated with my PACS, right? And that seems to be one of the challenges. Anything at RSNA help you think would help with that, or any vendors talking about interoperability with that, or?
Yeah, I think there's going to be two main routes radiologists will have access to AI. One will be through their PACS or imaging IT vendor, who will either have a suite of more deeply integrated AI solutions, and there you're looking at something like Ruby from Agfa or Riley from Fujifilm, or those sorts of platforms where really you're embedding AI algorithms into the broader workflow. I know GE have been doing the same
Edison
as well.
And GE, right?
Edison and GE, exactly.
Yeah.
But then the other side is if you're PACS vendor or you're dealing with a smaller PACS vendor who maybe isn't as far along or as established in terms of the AI space, there are independents out there like the ADOCs and the Blackfords, etc., who are bringing together a suite as well. So you may say, well, for AI, rather than doing it directly through our PACS, we'll have an independent platform that handles the AI side of things.
The APIs.
Yeah, working through APIs, etc. The other piece I think that was interesting that maybe was overlooked a little bit at RSNA, but certainly sort of bubbling under the surface, was the growing need for structured reporting and how AI can play a significant role in that.
Okay.
From structured reporting has been talked about for a long time in radiology. It's one of those things that you would think would be a no-brainer. But has taken a very long time to really gain traction. But we certainly felt from some of our discussions that AI is, because of the quantitative findings in terms of image analysis, the amount of measurements, risk scoring going on, and this whole wealth of tools that radiologists are now using, automating and structuring those results into the report to make that data machine readable as well is going to be really important moving forward as we move into that sort of next era of radiomics, and also in terms of, as vendors start to look at how data can be used within the preclinical sector or in terms of research as well. So I think because of that, we are going to start to see that structured reporting discussion starting to ramp up as well and become a differentiator in terms of not just how AI is used, but also how the output from AI is embedded into the broader clinical workflow.
Yeah, so for those listeners that aren't familiar with structured reporting, I mean, when we normally think about reports, we think about a radiologist dictating a report, and it's a narrative, right, that the radiologist provides. But structure, can you describe for us what you're talking about, structured reporting, so that our listeners understand?
Sure. Yeah. So you've got a couple of levels of it in terms of definition. The base level of structured reporting is essentially templates. So structured templates that a radiologist would fill in either with freeform text or particular scales of measurement or risk reporting scales, and they would do that manually.
Think like mammography or ultrasound.
Thinking BIRADS, etc., etc. Where it starts to get more interesting is what we would call, proper structured reporting, or also level 2 structured reporting, is where the reporting software essentially takes the results from the image and automatically lays them in machine readable format into the report itself, and therefore the radiologist only has to essentially accept those findings and then annotate on top of or dictate on top of those findings. So the idea is it streams the workflow for the radiologist, then not having to do manual measurement and manual dictation for those
the radiologist,
quantitative elements,
as opposed to sitting there doing a measurement and then having to dictate that into the report.
Correct.
It's just in the report, and they're just validating it, right, and saying, "Oh, that's right. Let me dictate my." If I know that a certain measurement's in a certain range, I know that there's pathology, and that's going to be my impression. But we're not talking about the software saying this patient has cancer. We're saying, here's the measurement, here's the data. Almost more like lab work, right? Where you're looking at the ranges and saying, well, this is out of range. What's your impression, right? I guess to that end, another piece with being able to get that data and work with structured reports. The other piece of that is maybe is with the workflow. If the AI determines that there's a likelihood of pathology in a certain image, they can kind of let that rise to the top of the list, right? And kind of help guide the radiologist in their workflow, reading the most important stuff first, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we've seen a maturing of that already in terms of that triage and workflow approach. I think in many sectors, you've got a number of vendors who are doing that actively today. I think where it starts to get even more interesting is when you start to support the radiologist in speeding up their reading and actually improving the quality of their reading as well. And that's something I'd say that has been underserved so far in terms of actual deployment, but we're starting to see that really gain some maturity in some sectors now. And there are a number of vendors who are coming out with some quite impressive research papers and quite impressive capabilities in terms of full suite capabilities for a given scan type, looking at not just key findings but also incidentals along the way as well. So the combination of those two has not just a radiologist reading efficiency gain but also a clinical care and diagnostic care quality improvement too.
Yeah, so interesting. There was another piece I think I was going to ask you about was the digital pathology has been a challenge in enterprise imaging. Number one, it's not read by radiologists, right? It's a completely different area, but massive amounts of data. And I'm wondering if there's been a lot of talk about kind of getting to this point where we have digital pathology as part of enterprise imaging. What did you see at RSNA about that?
Yeah, I think two things from RSNA. One was the increasing visibility of pathology in the show in terms of partnerships between pathology specialists and core imaging IT vendors. And secondly, just talking to vendors, the amount of customer discussions that they were having about how pathology will play with enterprise imaging moving forward. And I think there is a growing focus, and we're certainly hearing in terms of procurement deals, both US and international, that pathology is now being included in more and more of those tenders and procurement frameworks. Now, it's not necessarily an expectation that a vendor has a primary reading solution for digital pathology ready to go, but there is an expectation they have a roadmap for how digital pathology data is managed in the broader enterprise imaging platform, but also ideally has a roadmap in terms of how they plan to address primary reading down the line as well, either from interoperability and integration with a best-of-breed vendor there, or whether they have a specific partnership that they're planning or integrating. So the focus for RSNA wasn't really, how do we digitize pathology immediately from a primary reading perspective. It was more, how do we use that data and then enable solving care problems. And when you think about something like tumor boards, multidisciplinary tumor boards, that is a administrative and logistical nightmare in terms of bringing pathology data, radiology data, surgical data, the EHR, all of those pieces together for many health systems with their current makeup of applications.
And sometimes across organizational boundaries too. You have specialists sometimes they got to bring in from other places, and everybody's got to be looking at the same data. And so if we can get that pathology data in there, right? Because I think it's some of that other stuff is a little bit easier, but maybe there's a different conference for pathology. But which brings up an interesting point that RSNA seems like it's really become sort of the catch-all for all of clinical imaging, right? Even not just radiology. So there's other ologies that you start to see there. I even talked to ophthalmologists that was there. I talked to gastroenterology that was there, and emergency care doctors that were there, right? So it's definitely a wide-ranging conference, right? Not just radiology.
Absolutely, and I think that was something that we picked up on, and we've obviously tracked this market for a long time, but we've been talking about enterprise imaging probably for almost a decade now, and I would say only now is it really starting to actively be deployed and happen. Up until now, most have been dealing and still are dealing with enterprise radiology, which is consolidating the core parts of radiology together.
Or maybe RAD and CARD,
and that's been
right.
Exactly, or RAD and CARD being the two. But even there, you'd say, how many, healthcare providers or major healthcare provider systems have integrated RAD and CARD on a single platform? Not many today. With seamless integration and interoperability between them, it's limited. So because of the complexity and the fragmented nature of the segment, it's always been a challenge. But I think what COVID kind of helped a little bit is it helped a number of vendors to actually take a bit of stock from R&D perspective and say, we can actually fix some of these challenges now, or re-architect pieces of the puzzle that were difficult before, because we've almost got a bit of a lull in the sales cycle. We can almost gather breath, put some investment into that integration effort, and actually make these platforms better from an enterprise radiology perspective, but also future-proof them for enterprise imaging. So now we're starting to hear much more about, point-of-care ultrasound becoming an increasingly importantly used modality across lots of applications. We can now handle that better than we could maybe 2-3 years ago in most platforms. The same in emergency medicine, the same in ophthalmology, as you mentioned, and now pathology.
Yeah.
So I think we're getting to that phase of transition from focus being purely on enterprise radiology and potentially cardiology into actually what we would call enterprise imaging now, which is multi-ology and sort of native to all of those different ologies as well. And it becomes much more of that, as you said, enterprise clinical image management now.
Yeah, and as evidence that we keep seeing other ologies kind of easing their way into RSNA, right? And I like how you keep trying to find a silver lining in COVID. That's have a nice optimistic view there.
Well, any major market shock like that, you know, when I started in this industry, you know, we'd just gone through the major financial hit of sort of 2007 to 2009, and it spurred a real change in terms of the market then. And obviously on the back of that, particularly if you look at the US, you had meaningful use and all of the big changes in terms of you know, politics and healthcare changes there. I think COVID has done the same, but from a digitalization and you know, workflow efficiency point of view, and really shone a light on areas that were an issue for the industry or really needed solving. You know, digital pathology is a great example where you've now had the waiver in terms of primary diagnostic use for whole slide imaging and from the FDA. Now that probably wouldn't have happened as quickly and opened the door for digital pathology as quickly if COVID hadn't happened.
Agreed.
You've also on the pathology side had COVID shining a light on the fact that radiology was very quickly able to pivot to home reporting, and therefore radiologists could stay at home and work. Pathologists were still having to trawl into the pathology department to their microscopes during essentially hospitals being locked down during COVID, which obviously isn't great for some of your most important assets from a diagnostic perspective.
If you can get them out of the hospital, do it, right?
Exactly. Exactly. From a staff safety perspective and you know, risk perspective in terms of the service. So I think that's where COVID has been quite an interesting development in terms of the industry over the last year or two, is it's really shone light on, and in some cases provided some pretty extraordinary funding, you know, from government, etc., to help sort of move the needle that bit further and really progress things on from a healthcare provider point of view, in terms of investment in some of this technology.
Okay, well, that was all very informative, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. This has been nice.
Problem.
So thank
Happy
you.
to help.